Most people watching already know Arctic for one thing: absurdly good cooling at prices that usually feel a tier too low. Their tower air coolers have been priced to performance staples for years, and the Liquid Freezer AIO lineup built its reputation by doing things a little differently. Thicker than normal radiators, integrated VRM cooling, and support for up to 3 140mm fans on the Liquid Freezer 3420. These are coolers that consistently punch above their price bracket and land among the best performing AIOs you can buy. There's just one recurring problem: finding a PC case that actually accommodates those oversized radiators without clearance headaches is harder than it should be. So instead of compromising, Arctic decided to solve that problem themselves. They designed their own case. This is the Arctic Xtender VG, and it's very clearly engineered around one priority: making Arctic's massive liquid freezer coolers fit cleanly, comfortably, and without excuses. It can even house two 420mm AIOs at the same time, which is rare territory even for much larger full ATX enclosures. But when a case is designed this aggressively around cooling hardware, it comes with a risk. When a product is built around one idea this completely, the weaknesses usually aren't subtle, and in this case, they're anything but. Let's break it all down.
It's the money.
The Arctic Xtender VG is a large mid-tower that's very clearly engineered around extreme liquid cooling support. This is not a case that's trying to be all things to all builders. It knows exactly what it's designed for. Physically, it's a big enclosure. You're looking at roughly 529mm deep, 231mm wide, and 529mm tall, with support for motherboards all the way up to 285mm wide eATX. CPU air cooler clearance tops out at 171mm. GPUs can stretch out to an enormous 482mm, and power supplies up to 318mm are supported. If you install the drive cage, usable PSU length drops to about 200mm, which is something to keep in mind when planning your build. Also worth noting, if you install a side-mounted radiator, GPU clearances drops to 337mm. Cooling is where the Xtender VG really shows its intent. Out of the box, it comes with 5 Arctic ARGB fans pre-installed, 3 140mm reverse flow fans on the side set up as intake, and 2 120mm fans at the rear for exhaust. Up top, you can install either 3 120s or 3 140s, or a radiator up to 420mm. The side mount also supports up to a 420mm radiator, which means this case can run dual 420mm radiators at the same time. That's something you almost never see outside of a full tower case. The case includes 2 modular and removable fan and radiator brackets, allowing for unobstructed fan installation. The bracket attached supports 120mm fans, and removing them opens up the space for 140mm fans. Storage support is flexible. You can mount up to 2 3.5-inch hard drives and up to 4 2.5-inch SSDs, depending how you configure things. The drive cage itself is removable, which frees up space for longer power supplies. Tubing runs are custom loop components. Front I/O is positioned along the top right edge of the chassis and includes 2 5GB USB Type-A ports, a 10GB USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port, a headset jack, and the power button. Around back, you get 7 PCIe expansion slots, and all 7 are consumed if you use one of the Xtender VG's headline features, the pre-installed vertical GPU mount kit. Arctic includes both the vertical bracket and a PCIe 4x16 riser cable in the box with a 160mm cable length. It supports up to 3 slot graphics cards measuring as long as 482mm, though vertical GPU height can be more restrictive depending on the card's cooler design. The riser is fully PCIe 4.0 compliant and backwards compatible, so there's no need to source additional hardware just to run a vertical GPU layout here. Cable management space is generous with up to 35mm of clearance behind the motherboard tray and around the PSU area. Dust filtration is handled with magnetic filters up top and over the main intake area. Given how much air this case is designed to move, that filtration is doing real work here. At the time of filming, the Xtender VG is selling for $190, which firmly places it in the premium category. It's very clearly targeted builders planning serious liquid cooling setups rather than a conventional air-cooled gaming system. That price point shows up immediately in the build quality. The chassis is constructed by over 1 millimeter thick 20 gauge SECC steel with a durable powder coat finish. The front and left panels are 4 millimeter tempered glass, and this is the black version, which has a very heavy tint. With no internal lighting, the glass is dark enough to look almost mirror-like, which I actually think works well with the overall aesthetic. All of the main panels are toolless and attached using steel ball stud fasteners, but Arctic also includes a single captive thumb screw on both the left and right panels. With glass panels this large and this heavy, that extra bit of security is exactly what you want to see. The front glass panel can be removed by taking out a few screws, but given how massive and open this case is internally, I never felt the need to pull it off. Inside, there's an internal glass panel with an etched Arctic logo, which can be ARGB edge lit if you choose to hook it up. If that's not your thing, it can also be removed entirely, which I also appreciate. The main cable pass-throughs are fully grommeted, which at this price point is not a bonus feature, it's an expectation, and Arctic delivers there. Down at the bottom, the drive cage uses toolless drive sleds, and the 3.5-inch drive simply clip in. It's a small detail, but it makes installation quicker and cleaner. The vertical GPU mount comes pre-installed, and Arctic includes the 7 standard PCIe slot covers in a plastic accessory box in the case if you decide to switch back to a traditional horizontal layout. Arctic also includes 2 removable fan mounting rails that allow you to install 120 millimeter fans or radiators in the top and side positions. If you remove those rails, you get full unobstructed clearance for 140 millimeter fans and radiators without partially blocking airflow. That's a generally thoughtful design choice. Ventilation across the top and right panels is largely wide open using a large square grid pattern with magnetic fine mesh filters that actually line up cleanly with the ventilation cutouts. Unfortunately, the right side ventilation pattern is offset in a strange way. It extends far towards the rear, but not far enough towards the front, and that kind of undermines what I just talked about earlier, and it looks like it partially obstructs the airflow path. And then we get to what I consider a pretty significant design failure. There is no direct ventilation for the power supply. The bottom panel is solid, the top panel is solid. There's no dedicated intake, no clear airflow path for the PSU whatsoever. So exactly how is the power supply supposed to breathe? Now, Arctic is excellent at coolers and fans, and that part's not up for debate, but this diagram strongly suggests someone on the enclosure team doesn't understand how PC power supplies are actually cooled. The fan is not on the side of a PSU. Every standard ATX power supply that I know of pulls air in through the bottom or the top, and this case gives it neither. Now, yes, the PSU sits on a small raised bracket, and I'm fairly certain Arctic expects it to pull fresh air in from the large ventilated side panel, but that theory falls apart the moment you actually build in the case. Populate the drive cage and route normal PSU cabling, and that airflow path is effectively blocked. The PSU is now sitting in a mostly sealed pocket of stagnant air. Now, is this a fatal flaw that's going to instantly cook your power supply? Probably not. I need to do more targeted PSU thermal testing to make any hard claims there, but it's absolutely a design I'm not comfortable with. I would not run a cheaper bronze rated or borderline wattage power supply in this case, especially with the drive cage installed and cables blocking that airflow path. At a minimum, it's truly bizarre, but my test PSU is platinum rated with a 0 RPM fan mode, so I'll drive on with the review, I guess. So let's get into the build notes because this is where things start to kind of unravel. First up, mounting the motherboard requires removing the pre-installed vertical GPU bracket. Thankfully, that part isn't painful. It's just 3 screws and a long standoff. The one thing to keep in mind is to not install a motherboard screw in the bottom center standoff position because that's where that vertical bracket standoff threads back in. The center standoff is also non-captive, which is pretty standard on cases that support eATX boards. So if you're using an ATX board, cable routing needs to happen before the board goes in, especially the 24-pin ATX power cable, because once the board is installed, it blocks most of that front side pass-through. With a standard ATX board, this isn't an issue at all. There's plenty of room around the motherboard, and I was even able to connect all the top cables, including the dual 8-pin EPS power supplies, with the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 420 already installed. That also means there are zero clearance issues between the AIO and tall RAM or VRM heat sinks. On that front, everything works exactly as you expect. Where compatibility completely falls apart is with the graphics card, and it's almost as baffling as the lack of PSU ventilation. This case is massive. On paper, it should fit just about any GPU on the market. In reality, it doesn't. At least not in the vertical configuration you're paying extra for here in the VG. The problem is just simple geometry. The PSU shroud sits very high and the motherboard is mounted very low to make room for Arctic's own extra thick AIOs. The end result is extremely limited vertical clearance between the GPU and the AIO pump block. My mid-tier RX 9070 XT, which is only about 150 millimeters tall, is effectively the maximum height that fits here. Even then, I'm not comfortable with it because the AIO tubes are resting directly on top of the GPU heatsink, which is absolutely not ideal. And if you're thinking about running a modern high-end graphics card with a tall cooler, forget it. It's not fitting here. That makes the entire VG upcharge feel pointless. The main thing you're paying for, the vertical GPU layout, is functionally incompatible with most of the GPUs you'd realistically want to install in a case this large. Now, yes, there are AIOs with lower profile pump blocks, and there are tube orientations that might avoid interference, and yes, custom open loop setups would work beautifully here. But Arctic designed this case specifically around their own Liquid Freezer 3 AIOs, and that's not speculation. That's exactly how this case was pitched to me when Arctic sent both the case and the cooler, and yet they somehow failed to account for the height of modern graphics cards. Maybe if the case had proper PSU ventilation, the shroud could have been lowered to create more vertical clearance. I'm just saying. And no, I'm not usually this cynical in my reviews. That tends to happen when a brand I actually respect makes mistakes this fundamental. So let's get the last disappointment out of the way. The cable management area itself is well laid out, and Arctic includes enough quality Velcro straps that I didn't need a single zip tie. That part is solid. What's missing, and what I absolutely expect at this price point, is a basic fan and RGB hub. This is the top tier version of this case. It ships with 5 ARGB fans pre-installed, an ARGB logo panel, and is clearly meant to be paired with a large ARGB AIO, and yet there is no hub installed. Worse, the pre-installed daisy chainable fans aren't even daisy chained. I had to dig through a mess of cables to figure out which PWM and ARGB leads went to which fan so I could wire them in a sensible order, and that turned out to be mostly pointless anyway because the rear fan cables are so short they wouldn't reach where I needed them to go. What should have been a 3-minute cable management job turned into a 30-minute scavenger hunt, and at this price, that's simply not acceptable. All right. Let's set the criticism aside for a minute because this is where the Arctic Xtender VG does exactly what it was built to do. Thermals are a strong point here, and honestly, that's relief. Comparing the system on an open-air test bench to the same system installed in the case, averaged across 3 20-minute gaming sessions, CPU temperatures were statistically identical, and that's actually an excellent result for a setup using a top-mounted AIO and a vertically mounted graphics card. It shows that the dual rear exhaust fans are doing their job, effectively pulling hot air out of the case, most of it coming off the graphics card. Those 2 rear fans combined with the VRM fan on the Liquid Freezer 3 produced the lowest VRM temperatures I've measured in a panoramic glass case. VRM temps dropped by nearly 6 degrees compared to open air, which is significant. I've said this before in other case reviews, but it's worth repeating here. The first component to fail in most PCs is the motherboard, and reducing VRM temperature is one of the most effective ways to extend the motherboard's lifespan. The GPU results were the real surprise. With the card mounted vertically, GPU temperatures inside the case actually dropped by almost a full degree compared to open air, and that is actually uncommon. In most of these glass heavy enclosures, matching open air GPU temps is already a win. Seeing temps fall tells you the airflow is genuinely well optimized, with fresh air being directed exactly where the card needs it and hot air being exhausted efficiently. That result, however, only applies to the vertical GPU configuration. When the card was mounted horizontally, GPU temperatures rose by over 5 degrees, landing about 4 degrees hotter than open air. Less fresh air reaches the GPU intake and that orientation, and more heat reflects off the glass panel and recirculates back through the cooler. That behavior is pretty typical for panoramic glass cases, though in this case, the increase is slightly higher than average because we don't have any lower fans here. Now back to CPU thermals for a moment, because these numbers aren't directly comparable to my previous case reviews. In most of those, the Ryzen 7600X is capped at a 95 watt TDP. With the Liquid Freezer 3420 installed here, I removed that limit and ran a full overclock package. Power peaked at over 117 watts, and even then the CPU topped out at just 79.9 degrees Celsius. That's an excellent result, and it highlights just how effective this cooler is, especially in a case that's clearly designed around it. Those lower temperatures also had a direct impact on noise. Using my standard fan curve, the case fan stayed below 60% duty cycle and the AIO fan stayed under 80%. The result was a peak noise level of just 46.2 dBA, which is very good for a panoramic glass case with wide open ventilation and 8 fans spinning. Now, this is a hard case to wrap up because on one hand, there's a lot here that I generally like. From a pure build quality standpoint, the Xtender VG is excellent. It's one of the most solid cases I've worked with recently, right up there with brands like Inwin, Lian Li, Fractal, and Be Quiet. The materials feel premium, the panels are substantial, and nothing about it feels flimsy or rushed. And while I'm personally a little worn out on panoramic glass enclosures, the black glass on this case is legitimately well done. It elevates the look in a way most fish tank cases don't. With subtle internal lighting, it feels clean and understated, and with the lights off, it looks dark, reflective, and almost mysterious. It's a great looking case on a desk. From a cooling perspective, liquid cooling enthusiasts are going to look at this thing and immediately start dreaming. The radiator support is absurd, closed loop builds, custom loops, dual 420 setups. The thermal potential is undeniable there, and the performance numbers back that up. Unfortunately, that's where the praise stops. The design and engineering oversights here are simply too severe to ignore, and they completely undermine everything this case does well. The power supply airflow situation is unacceptable. A PSU intake path that can be easily blocked by a fully populated drive cage and normal cable routing isn't just an oversight, it's a liability. I can't come up with a reasonable explanation for why a nearly $200 PC case would ship without proper PSU ventilation in the bottom panel. And then there's the graphics card height restriction, which is frankly absurd in a case this large. Designing a massive enclosure that struggles to accommodate modern GPUs, especially in their very vertical configuration you're charging extra for, really makes no sense. It feels like Arctic designed this case around their AIOs in isolation without properly accounting for the real world components people are actually building with. Taken together, those two issues are deal breakers for me, not just inconveniences, not nitpicks, deal breakers. At nearly $200, expectations are high, and rightly so, based on the PSU airflow design alone and compounded by the GPU compatibility problems. I think Arctic missed the mark here badly. The Xtender VG shows that Arctic knows cooling, fans, and radiators inside and out, but it also shows that case design is a very different discipline. At least judging from this, Arctic probably should stick to making coolers.